The night sky above Normandy burned red, filled with the echo of distant artillery. The earth trembled under the weight of war, and smoke crawled across the ruined French countryside like a living shadow. In a small farmhouse, shattered by shell fire and half swallowed by mud, 12 exhausted soldiers crouched in silence. They had no command, no backup, and no map left that wasn't stained in blood. But inside that ruin, one man's trembling hands rested over an old, green metal radio set, his last connection to the world. His name was Corporal James Whittaker, a 26-year-old signalman from Manchester, England. He wasn't a commander or a sniper, not even a frontline soldier. He was the man behind the radio, the one who carried words through the noise of war. But tonight, words would be his only weapon. For hours, German shells had torn the countryside apart. Captain Rowe, their unit leader, had been killed instantly when shrapnel sliced through the wall beside him. The rest of the men, soaked in mud and terror, waited for an order that would never come. Outside, the forest whispered with enemy movement. The sound of tank treads echoed faintly in the mist. Somewhere out there, the Nazis were hunting. Private Collins muttered under his breath, his voice shaking. "We're done for. Nobody even knows we're alive." Whittaker looked up from the radio, his face pale under the flickering lantern. "Someone knows," he said quietly. "Me," the radio hissed with static. Allied frequencies were jammed, full of broken signals and German interference. Every time Whittaker tried to send an SOS, he could hear German operators cutting through, mocking the British, sending fake commands, feeding lies into the chaos. It was like a battle fought not with bullets, but with voices. Then an idea struck him. A dangerous, almost suicidal thought. The Germans were using deception. What if he used it back? He adjusted the frequency dial with frozen fingers, listening carefully. Between the static, he caught fragments of enemy transmissions, real German chatter. His heart pounded as he recognized code words used by panzer units. He wasn't just hearing them. He was inside their network. He hesitated. If he tried to speak on their channel and got caught, they'd trace the signal within minutes. But what choice did he have? His men were surrounded, their ammunition nearly gone, and HQ had no clue where they were. If he couldn't reach help, maybe he could confuse the enemy instead. He took a deep breath and leaned toward the mic. His voice shook as he whispered in rough, broken German, "Heer Einheit 7. Panzerkolonne unter Beschuss. Wir brauchen Unterstützung. Sofort. This is Unit 7, Panzer column under attack. Need reinforcements immediately." The line went silent. Whittaker's pulse raced. For 10 endless seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, a voice replied. Calm, official, confident. Verstanden. Reinforcements underway. Whittaker's eyes widened. It worked. He had just fooled the German command. He sat back, staring at the radio as the realization sank in. He could mislead them. He could buy time, maybe even turn their own power against them. He called over Sergeant Miller, the oldest man in the squad. "Sarge, I just made a panzer unit call for backup, and they're coming to the wrong place." Miller frowned. "You're telling me you just sent a fake distress call? To the Germans?" Whittaker nodded. "If they can trick us, we can trick them. Let's make them chase ghosts." Over the next hour, Whittaker became the ghost in the radio. He shifted voices, frequencies, and call signs, pretending to be different German units. One ambushed near the river, another cut off in the hills, another losing tanks near the village. Each message sent German divisions in the wrong direction. Allied artillery, miles away, began striking empty fields where Whittaker had guided them. The Germans were wasting precious time and fuel, running in circles. The other soldiers could barely believe it. Private Collins whispered, "Bloody hell, he's fighting the whole army with a radio." But it came at a price. Every transmission risked exposing his position. The Germans weren't fools. Their radio detection units were already scanning for the source of the strange signals. With each fake SOS, the invisible noose tightened around them. By 3 a.m., Whittaker's voice had grown hoarse. His hands trembled as he adjusted dials and coded messages, sweat dripping despite the cold. In the background, his men slept with rifles across their chests, trusting a signalman's gamble to keep them alive. Then, amid the static, a voice broke through, one he'd never heard before. Deep, confident German and close. Signal traced. Origin near Saint Laurent. Neutralize immediately, Whittaker froze. The Germans had found them. He turned off the transmitter instantly, heart pounding in his chest. Outside, through the cracks of the ruined farmhouse, he could hear trucks, engines growling softly in the fog. They were coming. He had minutes, maybe less. He looked at the sleeping men, the faces of soldiers who had already accepted death hours ago. Then he looked down at the radio, the same machine that had fooled an army. He realized what he needed to do. He flipped the switch back on. Sergeant Miller stirred awake. "What are you doing, Whitaker?" "They're tracing us!" Whitaker didn't answer. He pressed the transmitter and began to speak again, calmly, firmly, as if he were one of them. "This is Panzer Column 4, he said in German. "Under heavy Allied fire. Coordinates, 49 degrees 22 north, 055 west. Request artillery immediately." Those were his own coordinates. He leaned back, closing his eyes, and listened to the confirmation come through. Artillery fire approved. He knew what that meant. He'd just called a German strike on himself. Outside, the trucks halted. Boots hit the mud. German soldiers were moving closer. The fog swallowed their silhouettes as they raised rifles toward the farmhouse. Whitaker gripped the transmitter one last time, whispering, "For Manchester." "For the lads." The first shells fell 12 minutes later. The ground erupted, flames rising into the sky. The shockwave shattered what remained of the farmhouse. German trucks disappeared in fire and smoke. Inside, Whitaker's radio exploded in a flash of light, cutting the transmission mid-sentence. When dawn broke, Allied infantry advanced into the area. The smoke still hung thick, and the ground was cratered with burning wrecks. They found 11 survivors of the 13th Signal Company, buried in mud and debris, dazed, half-deaf, but alive. And in the center of the ruins, beside the twisted remains of his radio, they found Whitaker. His hand still clutched the microphone, his face calm, almost peaceful. He had died in silence, the way he lived, behind the noise. Later reports revealed that Whitaker's transmissions had misled an entire German panzer division for nearly 6 hours. Dozens of enemy tanks had been diverted or destroyed by friendly fire. The Allies advanced 3 miles further inland before the Germans even realized what had happened. His name was never printed in major newspapers. His act was buried deep in military archives. But for those who survived that night, he wasn't just a radio operator. He was the man who used words to fight tanks, the ghost in the radio, who turned lies into victory. And though the war rolled on, somewhere in the static of old recordings, they said you could still hear his faint Morse code, tapping through the echoes of history. When the sun rose over the shattered ruins of Saint-Laurent, the battlefield looked like a graveyard of metal. Tanks lay split open like carcasses, rifles half buried in mud, helmets scattered across the ditches. Smoke drifted over the fields where men had fought and fallen just hours before, and among the wreckage, Allied soldiers walked in silence, searching for survivors, for bodies, for anything that proved someone had lived through the night. They found the survivors of the 13th Signal Company huddled near what was left of the farmhouse. Their faces were pale, their uniforms torn, but their eyes burned with something no words could explain. Sergeant Miller, coughing blood, clutched a piece of twisted metal, the remains of Whitaker's radio. He wouldn't let anyone take it from him. When an officer asked what happened, Miller could barely speak. He called them, he whispered. Called the Germans, and made them kill themselves. At first, nobody believed him. The idea was absurd. One man fooling an entire German division? But when reconnaissance reports confirmed the strange pattern of enemy movements and self-inflicted artillery strikes, the truth started to surface. Someone inside that chaos had turned the German command net against itself. And it worked. Word spread fast through the camp. Soldiers who never met Whitaker spoke his name like a legend. A signalman who used his radio like a weapon. The man who lied so others could live. Even the brass at headquarters couldn't ignore the results. The enemy's front line had been thrown into confusion, their supply convoys delayed, and their reinforcements misdirected, all because of a series of fake transmissions sent by a dead corporal. By afternoon, the surviving men of the 13th were evacuated to a field hospital near Bayeux. Miller sat on his cot, bandaged and exhausted, replaying every sound, every word Whitaker had spoken through that radio. The rhythmic click of Morse code still echoed in his ears. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't forget. A few days later, an intelligence officer from the Allied Signals Division visited the camp. Major Howard Greaves, a sharp-eyed man with the air of someone who'd spent too long in rooms full of maps and secrets. He asked Miller to describe exactly what Whitaker had done. Miller explained everything. How Whitaker intercepted enemy chatter, mimicked their code words, faked distress calls, and misled their forces. Howard listened quietly, taking notes. When Miller finished, the major leaned back and said, "That could change everything." He wasn't exaggerating. Up until that point, radio deception was mostly used by the Germans, fake orders, ghost units, and false coordinates. The Allies had tried small tricks before, but nothing on the scale of what Whitaker had accidentally achieved in one desperate night. His improvisation, born of fear and courage, had created a new kind of weapon: confusion. Within a week, Major Greaves requested a new experimental task force under the Signals Division. Its purpose was simple: to weaponize deception. They called it Operation Echo, and its core principle came directly from Whitaker's last stand: if you can't outgun the enemy, outsmart his ears. Meanwhile, the survivors of the 13th were reassigned and scattered among different units. None of them wanted to leave France. They wanted to finish what Whitaker started. Collins, the youngest, volunteered for frontline radio duty, saying quietly, "If I die, I'll die talking." By late summer 1944, Operation Echo was in motion. A small team of linguists, codebreakers, and radio experts were assembled behind enemy lines. They studied Whitaker's notes, the captured German frequency charts, and the fragments of transmissions recorded during the night he died. The team's mission was to imitate German communications so convincingly that the enemy would fight ghosts. They practiced endlessly, mimicking signal strength, timing, and even the pauses between words used by German officers. They learned the slang, the abbreviations, the rhythm of commands. They built makeshift transmitters designed to sound like authentic Wehrmacht radios. And at the heart of it all, on a worn wooden table, sat the broken dial from Whitaker's radio, kept as a symbol. One cold morning in September, they went live. Somewhere near the French town of Falaise, the team began transmitting. They posed as a German logistics convoy requesting fuel and reinforcements at a specific coordinate. Within hours, real German trucks were rerouted in that direction, straight into an ambush zone manned by Allied artillery. The strike destroyed 12 vehicles and a fuel depot. The experiment worked better than anyone expected. The Germans believed the transmissions were genuine. Their own operators confirmed them. Even when they grew suspicious, it was too late. The chaos was spreading faster than they could contain it. Over the following months, Operation Echo evolved into a larger network of coordinated radio trickery. Entire phantom divisions were created over the airwaves. Fake commanders gave real orders. Whole battalions were sent chasing shadows, while the real Allied forces advanced from other directions. And every man involved in the operation knew the name of the man who had inspired it: Corporal James Whitaker, the ghost in the radio. Back at the front line, Sergeant Miller received a letter from Major Greaves. It wasn't official recognition, no medals, no ceremony. Just a simple note. Your friend's idea is saving lives every day. His voice still fights for us. Miller folded the letter and placed it inside his jacket, next to the small metal knob from Whitaker's radio that he carried everywhere. He didn't need medals. That piece of metal was enough. As the war dragged toward its brutal end, Operation Echo's effects grew legendary among Allied ranks. Entire divisions credited unseen ghost signalers for saving their units. One American tank crew reported hearing a fake German broadcast warning of Allied traps that never existed, causing enemy tanks to retreat into real ambushes instead. Each false whisper over the air made the Germans question their own orders. By the time Allied forces liberated Paris, the seeds planted by Whitaker's final broadcast had grown into a forest of deception. Intelligence officers later estimated that fake transmissions had diverted over 20,000 German troops, delayed reinforcements by days, and directly influenced the outcome of multiple operations. And all of it traced back to one corporal who refused to die quietly. But the men who survived that night never forgot the cost. Collins often said that courage doesn't come from bullets or ranks. It comes from silence, from the moment you decide to act when nobody's watching. For him, Whitaker wasn't just a hero. He was proof that a single man, armed with nothing but a radio and a mad idea, could rewrite the story of a battlefield. After the war, Whitaker's family received a short telegram from the British Army. Corporal James Whitaker, missing, presumed killed in action. Saint Laurent sector, no mention of what he'd done. No glory, no recognition. The war was full of ghosts, and history had little room for one more. But among those who knew, his story lived on quietly, passed between veterans, told over late-night drinks, whispered through radio static. Sometimes a signal operator would say, when the air was clear and the static soft, you could still hear faint taps in the distance, as if someone out there was still transmitting. Whitaker's trick became a teaching example in post-war intelligence schools. They called it the Whitaker method, the art of using enemy communication systems to turn confusion into a weapon. Even in modern military strategy, echoes of his idea remain. Cyber deception, false broadcasts, and psychological warfare all trace their lineage to that night in Normandy when one signalman refused to stay silent. The war ended. The radio towers went quiet, but the myth of the ghost in the radio never did. Because in every soldier's heart, there's a longing for stories like his, where courage isn't about victory, but about defiance. Where one man, trapped and forgotten, can still turn the tide of battle through sheer will. In the end, Whitaker didn't just send fake messages. He sent a warning through time that even in the darkest moments, the smallest signal can change everything. And though his voice was lost in the static of war, its echo carried forward, whispering through generations of soldiers who learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak. When the world expects you to be silent. Winter came early to Europe in 1944. The fields of France turned cold and colorless, and the war that had begun with fire now crawled forward under a blanket of snow. But beneath the ice and mud, something new was taking shape. A war not fought with bullets, but with voices. It had begun with a single man's idea, born out of desperation, and now it was growing into a weapon the enemy couldn't see or touch. The Allies called it Operation Echo. The Germans called it madness. Both were right. In a dimly lit tent far behind the front lines, radios hummed like nervous hearts. Dozens of operators sat at their stations, headphones pressed tight, sending and receiving streams of code that could mean life or death. The room smelled of burnt wiring, coffee, and fear. Among them sat Lieutenant Arthur Hayes, a former journalist turned intelligence officer, who had once written about soldiers like Whitaker, never imagining he'd become one of them. Hayes was part of the first generation of Allied phantom signalers. Their orders were strange. Make the enemy believe in ghosts. Create divisions that didn't exist, battalions that were never born, commanders that breathed only through static. Using captured German equipment and Whitaker's method, they began weaving illusions across the airwaves. Every transmission had to sound real. Tone, code, language, even pauses. A single mistake, a single word out of rhythm, could reveal the truth. For weeks, Hayes and his team crafted lies with the precision of poets. They built imaginary units with names and histories, complete with fake supply needs and battle plans. They transmitted fake orders for Panzergruppe 17 to regroup near the Ardennes, causing real German divisions to shift east, leaving gaps that the Allies quickly exploited. Each time it worked, they raised a silent toast to the man who had started it all. "To Whitaker," Hayes would whisper, lifting his mug of black coffee. "May the static never rest." By December, Operation Echo had become more than an experiment. It was a ghost army spread across Europe, voices without faces, commanders without soldiers. They spoke from the shadows, guiding real men toward victory through deception. The Germans grew paranoid, constantly suspecting their own messages. Some units refused to act without double confirmation, slowing their response times fatally. The once efficient machine of the Wehrmacht was starting to choke on its own confusion, but success came with a cost. The operators of Operation Echo lived in silence and secrecy. Their names could never be recorded. Their missions could never be spoken aloud. If captured, they would be treated not as soldiers, but as spies, executed on the spot. Every broadcast could be their last. On the frozen outskirts of Belgium, Hayes received orders for the operation that would define his life. Echo Phantom. 9. Intelligence suggested that a massive German counterattack was imminent near the Ardennes forest, an offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies were spread thin, and any delay in enemy movement could save thousands of lives. Hayes and his team had one task: convince the Germans that an entire Allied armored division was stationed nearby, a division that didn't exist. The plan was insane. They had no tanks, no troops, no base, just radios, speakers, and courage. But they'd done crazier things before. They set up their transmitters in abandoned barns and covered them with snow for insulation. At night, the men sat in the dark, sending coded chatter, pretending to be tank commanders, artillery officers, and field engineers. They discussed imaginary rations, repairs, and map coordinates. Every word was designed to be overheard, and the Germans heard. Within days, intercepted reports confirmed that the German command had diverted a panzer unit north to counter the Phantom division. That single misdirection bought the Allies 48 critical hours, enough to reinforce the real front lines and prevent a catastrophic breach. Hayes' team had just saved thousands of men without firing a shot. But the victory came with a shadow. The Germans were furious. They began hunting for the ghost radios that were haunting their frequencies. Specialized detection squads combed the forests, triangulating signals, narrowing down their sources. The hunters were getting closer. On the fourth night, snow falling like ash, Hayes' team picked up a chilling transmission on their own frequency, a German voice whispering in English. "We are coming for you, ghosts!" The operators froze. The enemy had found them. Hayes made the call to evacuate. They packed the equipment in silence, hearts pounding, the cold biting through their gloves. Just as they prepared to leave, one of the younger signalers, Private Bennett, noticed something strange. The last signal they sent had echoed back faintly through the static, as if someone on the other end was repeating it. Hayes frowned, checked the logbook, and realized what it was. Their signal was being mirrored. Someone, somewhere, was copying their style perfectly. It was a trap. Before they could move, the night erupted. Mortar shells tore through the snow. The ground shook as German flares lit up the trees. The sky turned white, then red. Hayes and his men dived for cover as shrapnel rained down. Radios shattered, wires snapped. Bennett screamed as a fragment struck his shoulder, throwing him against the snow. Hayes crawled through the chaos, dragging him behind a broken wall. The transmitters were gone, but one half-broken set still buzzed weakly. Whitaker's old frequency carried forward through every operation. Hayes grabbed the mic, blood dripping down his temple, and began transmitting blindly. He sent false coordinates again and again, his voice shaking, feeding lies into the darkness. Enemy units retreating east. Heavy losses. Request reinforcements at Grid 22. He kept repeating it until the static went silent, until he heard the distant rumble of German engines turning, moving away. They had taken the bait. When the shelling finally stopped, only 5 men were left alive. The forest was burning. The snow melted into black mud. Hayes' face was pale, but his eyes glimmered with something close to disbelief. "They still believe," he murmured. "Even now they believe." Hours later, Allied scouts found them among the ruins. Hayes was barely conscious, clutching the remains of his radio like a lifeline. Before he passed out, he whispered, "Tell them the ghosts did their job." News of the Phantom Division spread quietly through the Allied ranks. Commanders called it the most effective deception of the campaign. Some said the Germans delayed their final assault by nearly 2 full days, a delay that changed the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. The official report credited unidentified field units under Signal's division, but among the men who knew there was no mystery, it was Whitaker's ghost at work again. Through Hayes, through every operator who dared to lie louder than death. When Hayes finally recovered weeks later, he was reassigned to London. Operation Echo was now classified as one of the most successful covert missions of the war. Dozens of operators had died for it, their names erased, their courage buried in secret archives. But in quiet corners of the Signal's headquarters, among those who understood what had been done, There was one picture pinned to a corkboard, a faded photograph of Corporal James Whitaker, the signalman from Manchester who had started it all. Beneath it, someone had written 3 words in pencil: "The ghost lives on." As the war neared its end, Operation Echo continued to echo, through the final push into Germany, through the liberation of Europe, through the silence that followed. The Ghost Army never stopped talking. Even as cities fell and nations burned, their invisible voices danced through the air, turning chaos into order, lies into salvation. When the guns finally went quiet in May 1945, Hayes returned home. He carried a small box in his bag. Inside it, the broken frequency dial from Whitaker's original radio. He kept it on his desk for the rest of his life. Sometimes, late at night, he would tune into old frequencies, listening to the faint hum of static. And once, he swore he heard something, a single pulse, soft and rhythmic, like Morse code repeating endlessly through time. 3 short taps. 3 long. 3 short again, SOS. He smiled and whispered, "Rest easy, Corporal." Message received. And in that moment, the ghost in the radio finally faded. Not in defeat, but in peace. His war was over, but his echo would never die. For 2 long days, Daniel Reed's phantom broadcast echoed through the freezing forest. A signal that shouldn't exist. A voice that belonged to a ghost division. It whispered promises of Allied tanks rolling through the night, of reinforcements that never were. And the Germans took the bait. From a distance, Sergeant Thomas Hale watched through his binoculars as enemy convoys shifted direction. Dust clouds rose over the icy ridges as panzer columns began to realign, heading straight toward the empty valley where Daniel had lured them. "Holy hell," Hale muttered, lowering the glass. They bought it. The trap had been simple and suicidal. Daniel's fake SOS had convinced the German command that an Allied regiment was stranded east of the ridge waiting for rescue. In reality, that valley was barren, filled only with abandoned trucks, destroyed jeeps, and a handful of booby traps laid by the engineers before retreat. But just behind that valley, hidden in the forest shadows, lay the real ambush line. American anti-tank guns, a handful of Shermans, and 2 platoons of exhausted infantry waited silently, their breath fogging in the cold air. Captain Morgan, the man who'd given Daniel permission to play his dangerous radio game, crouched beside him. "They're coming right into the kill zone," he said quietly. "God help us if they find out it's a bluff before they reach it." Daniel nodded, his hands trembling slightly over the radio dials. Every transmission was a dance with death. German intercept teams were actively triangulating his signal. He had to keep it alive long enough for the trap to close, but not so long that they could pinpoint him. He leaned toward the microphone again, his voice low and weary. The voice of a soldier barely hanging on. "Command, this is Echo 1. Still holding out. German armor closing from the north. Need support now." He paused, then added a touch of static, an old trick to make it sound like a long-range signal. "Repeat, holding position. Awaiting orders." Static crackled, and for a brief second, Daniel heard German chatter bleeding through another frequency. They were close, maybe too close. Then the first distant rumble came. Tanks, heavy ones. The ground began to vibrate. Captain Morgan grabbed his field glasses and looked toward the ridge. Dark shapes emerged through the fog. Massive iron beasts crawling down the slope, headlights faintly glowing through the snow. Behind them came half-tracks and infantry trucks, the full weight of a German armored column bearing down on what they believed was a trapped Allied unit. Morgan's voice was tense. "Wait for it." "Not yet. Wait." Every man in the hidden tree line held his breath. Rifles rested on frozen logs. Machine gunners kept their barrels low. Even the forest seemed to stop breathing. Then, boom, a single shot from an American 76mm anti-tank gun screamed across the valley. The shell slammed into the lead panzer, erupting in a fireball that tore the night apart. "Fire!" Captain Morgan roared. The forest exploded with thunder. Dozens of muzzles flashed at once, anti-tank guns, bazookas, machine guns, all pouring fire into the confused German column. The panzers tried to turn, their treads grinding on the icy ground, but they were boxed in. The valley was too narrow. One by one, enemy vehicles went up in flames. The air turned black with smoke and the acrid smell of burning oil. German infantry scattered, diving for ditches that didn't exist. They'd walked straight into hell. Daniel watched through a cracked window, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. He had been the voice that led them here, the ghost they'd followed. "This is for all the real Echo ones out there," he whispered under his breath. For half an hour, the battle raged like thunder trapped between mountains. The sound of explosions bounced through the valley until even the sky seemed to echo with chaos. And when it was over, when the smoke finally cleared, what had been a German armored spearhead was now a graveyard of twisted steel. The Allied line held, but victory came at a price. Inside the farmhouse, Daniel's radio had gone silent. The enemy had finally locked onto his frequency. Their artillery began hammering the area. The first shell hit a nearby barn, shattering the roof. The second struck closer, sending shards of glass flying across Daniel's face. "Reed! We gotta move!" Captain Morgan shouted. Daniel grabbed the radio set, his lifeline, and started to pack it up. But a final transmission crackled through before he could shut it down. "Echo 1, your signal. We heard you. We're coming." It was Allied command, for the first time in days. They'd picked up his fake distress call, thinking it was real. Reinforcements were on the way. Daniel froze. He almost laughed. The irony was painful. His fake SOS, meant to trick the Germans, had now reached his own commanders. He keyed the mic one last time. "Negative, command. Stand down. Trap complete. Valley secure." Then the building shook violently, a direct hit. Morgan and 2 soldiers dragged him out of the rubble, coughing, blood running down his temple. The farmhouse was gone. His radio, crushed. But the message had already done its job. That night, under the glow of burning tanks and falling snow, the surviving Allied troops began pulling back to safer ground. Behind them, the valley burned like a scar on the earth, proof that even a single voice, a single signalman, could change the course of a battle. Daniel Reed sat against a tree, bandaged and half-conscious, as medics moved between the wounded. Captain Morgan knelt beside him. "You did it, kid," he said quietly. "You saved the line." Daniel gave a faint smile, his eyes half open. "Guess the radio finally said something worth hearing." In the distance, the sound of Allied artillery rolled like thunder, pushing the enemy back, 1 mile at a time, and though no medals would ever bear his name, and no general's speech would mention his ghost signal, the soldiers who lived that night never forgot it. They would tell the story for years, of the signalman who faked a cry for help, and in doing so, led an army of steel into its own grave. The man who turned silence into victory. The morning after the battle, the forest was silent again. Too silent. Smoke still curled from the burnt-out husks of tanks, rising into the pale gray sky like ghosts of the men who once fought inside them. Snowflakes fell gently over blackened metal, softening the scars of the night before. Daniel Reed lay in a makeshift field hospital tent a few miles from the front. His head was wrapped in white bandages, his uniform still streaked with blood and mud. Every breath burned, but he was alive. And for the first time in weeks, the gunfire had stopped. Through the tent flap, he could see soldiers moving slowly between the wrecks, collecting helmets, tags, and the few survivors who still called out for help. Victory, he realized, didn't sound like cheering. It sounded like whispers. Captain Morgan entered quietly, a cigarette between his lips, fatigue etched into every line of his face. He sat beside Daniel's cot, exhaling a slow stream of smoke. "You sleep at all?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not really. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that static again. The radio?" He nodded. "Yeah, that damn signal. Still echoing in my head." Morgan smiled faintly. "Well, that damn signal stopped an entire German advance. You did something none of us could have pulled off." Daniel looked away. "I didn't even fire a shot." Morgan leaned forward. "Doesn't matter. You made them fire at ghosts. You made them chase what wasn't there. That's strategy and courage." Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. A column of Allied trucks rolled past, filled with fresh troops and supplies. the reinforcements that would finally push the line forward again. Word had spread quickly. The counterattack in St. Vith was successful, and the Germans were retreating. But among the men, a rumor had also begun. They whispered about a mysterious radio signal, a lone Allied operator who had faked an SOS and turned a German assault into a slaughter. No one knew his name, only that he'd fooled the enemy so completely they'd walked right into their own graveyard. They called him the Phantom of St. Vith. When a war correspondent came through the camp later that afternoon, she stopped by Daniel's cot. "They say you were the signalman," she said, holding a small notepad. "Is it true?" Daniel gave a tired smile. "Maybe, but it's not much of a story without the others. I just sent the message. They're the ones who fought the battle," she smiled softly. Sometimes one message changes everything. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep again. He stepped outside, limping slightly, and looked toward the distant valley. The snow reflected faintly under the moonlight, glowing over the smoldering wrecks like a frozen sea of fire. He thought about the voices he had heard over the radio, the German interceptors, their calm confidence before realizing they were walking into death. He thought about the Allied soldiers who died believing his fake distress call was real. War, he realized, didn't deal in clean victories. It was a blur of deception and survival. Still, one truth remained. They had lived. And that was enough. A medic walked by and stopped when he saw Daniel standing in the cold. "You should be resting, Corporal." "I will," Daniel said quietly. "Just wanted to hear the silence for a bit." The medic nodded and left him alone. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal dial, a broken piece of his old radio set, the only thing that survived the shelling. He turned it over in his hand like a lucky coin. He whispered, "Message received." A few days later, Daniel Reed was transferred to the rear for recovery. Official reports credited the ambush to strategic misdirection and intelligence coordination. His name never appeared in the papers, but every soldier who had been there knew who started it. Weeks later, when the Battle of the Bulge finally ended, the Allies had pushed the Germans back for good. The tide of the war had turned, and in small ways, Daniel's ghost signal had helped make it happen. On his last night in Europe, before boarding the transport ship home, Daniel sat alone on the dock at Le Havre, France. The sea was dark and endless, the air heavy with the smell of diesel and salt. He looked out toward the horizon and thought about how close the world had come to falling apart, and how fragile every act of courage really was. Sometimes heroism wasn't about charging with a rifle or storming a hill. Sometimes it was about sitting in the dark, pretending to be someone you're not, and praying the enemy believes your lie long enough for others to live. A voice called from the ship. "Corporal Reed, time to board." Daniel stood, gripping the small radio dial in his palm one last time before slipping it into his coat pocket. He didn't look back as he climbed the ramp. The waves crashed below, and for a moment, the sound almost resembled faint radio static, the ghost of a signal fading into history. And somewhere, buried in the archives of forgotten battles, the story of the man who faked an SOS and turned to war with his voice alone would remain untold, but never truly lost. Because legends, like radio waves, never really die. They just keep echoing through the silence.